The Picture in the House by Howard Philip Lovecraft. Searchers after horror haunt strange and far places. For them are the catacombs of Ptolemais and the carven mausolea of the nightmare countries. They climb to the moonlit towers of Rhine castles and falter down black cobweb steps beneath the scattered stones of forgotten cities in Asia. The haunted woods and the desolate mountains are their shrines, and they linger around the sinister monoliths on uninhabited islands. But the true epicure in the terrible, to whom a new thrill of unutterable ghastliness is the chief end and justification of existence, esteems most of all the ancient, lonely farmhouses of backwoods New England. For there the dark elements of strength, solitude, grotesqueness, and ignorance combine to form the perfection of the hideous. Most horrible of all sights are the little unpainted wooden houses remote from the travelled ways, unusually squatted upon some damp, grassy slope or leaning against some gigantic outcropping of rock. 200 years and more they have leaned or squatted there, while the vines have crawled and the trees have swelled and spread. They are almost hidden now in lawless luxuriances of green and guardian shrouds of shadow, but the small-paned windows still stare shockingly, as if blinking through a lethal stupor which wards off madness by dulling the memory of unutterable things. In such houses have dwelt generations of strange people, whose like the world has never seen, seized with a gloomy and fanatical belief which exiled them from their kind. Their ancestors sought the wilderness for freedom. There the scions of a conquering race indeed flourished, free from the restrictions of their fellows, but cowed in an appalling slavery to the dismal phantasms of their own minds. Divorced from the enlightenment of civilization, the strength of these Puritans turned to the singular channels, and in their isolation, morbid self-repression and struggle for life with relentless nature. There came to them the dark, furtive traits from their prehistoric depths of their cold northern heritage. By necessity practical and by philosophy stern, these folks were not beautiful in their sins. Erring as all mortals must, they were forced by their rigid code to seek concealment above all else, so that they came to use less and less taste in what they concealed. Only the silent, sleepy, staring houses in the backwoods can tell all that has lain hidden since the early days, and they are not communicative, being loath to shake off the drowsiness which helps them forget. Sometimes one feels that it would be merciful to tear down these houses, for they must often dream. It was to a time-battered edifice of this description that I was driven one afternoon in November 1896, by a rain of such chilling copiousness that any shelter was preferable to exposure. I had been travelling for some time amongst the people of the Miskatonic Valley in quest for a certain genealogical data, and from the remote, devious, and problematical nature of my course, I had deemed it convenient to employ a bicycle, despite the lateness of the season. Now I found myself on an apparently abandoned road, which I had chosen as the shortest cut to Arkham. Overtaken by the storm at a point far from any town, and confronted with no refuge save the antique and repellent wooden building which blinked with bleared windows from between two huge leafless oaks near the foot of a rocky hill. Distant though it was from the remnant of a road, this house none the less impressed me unfavourably the very moment I espied it. Honest, wholesome structures do not stare at travellers so slyly and hauntingly, and in my genealogical researches I had encountered legends of a century before which biased me against a place of this kind. Yet the force of the elements was such as to overcome my scruples, and I did not hesitate to wheel my machine up to the weedy rise of the closed door which seemed at once so suggestive and secretive. I had somehow taken it for granted that the house was abandoned, yet as I approached it I was not so sure. For though the walks were indeed overgrown with weeds, they seemed to retain their nature a little too well to argue complete desertion. Therefore, instead of trying the door, I knocked, feeling as I did so a trepidation I could scarcely explain. As I waited on the rough, mossy rock which served as a doorstep, I glanced at the neighbouring windows and the panes of fanlight above me, and noticed that although rattling and almost opaque with dirt, they were not broken. The building, then, must still be inhabited, despite its isolation and general neglect. However, my rapping evoked no response, so after repeating the summons I tried the rusty latch and found the door unfastened. Inside was a little vestibule, with walls from which the plaster was falling, and through the doorway came a faint but peculiar hateful odour. I entered, carrying my bicycle, and closed the door behind me. Ahead rose a narrow staircase, flanked by a small door probably leading to the cellar, while the left and right were closed doors leading to rooms on the ground. Leaning my cycle against the wall, I opened the door to the left, and crossed to a small, low-ceiled chamber but dimly lighted by its two dusty windows and furnished in the barest and most primitive possible way. It appeared to be a kind of sitting-room, for it had a table and several chairs, and an immense fireplace, over which ticked an antique clock on a mantel. Books and papers were very few, and in the prevailing gloom I could not readily discern the titles. What interested me was the uniform air of archaism on display, and in every visible detail. Most of the houses in this region I had found rich in relics of the past, but here the antiquity was curiously complete, for in all of the room I could not discover a single article of definitely post-revolutionary date. Had the furnishings been less humble, the place would have been a collector's paradise. As I surveyed this quaint apartment, I felt an increase in that aversion first excited by the bleak exterior of the house. Just what it was that I feared or loathed I could by no means define, but something in the whole atmosphere seemed redolent of unhallowed age, of unpleasant crudeness, and of secrets which should be forgotten. I felt disinclined to sit down, and wandered about, examining the various articles which I had noticed. The first object of my curiosity was a book of medium size lying on the table and presenting such an antediluvian aspect that I marvelled at beholding it outside of a library or a museum. It was bound in leather with metal fittings, and was in an excellent state of preservation, being altogether an unusual sort of volume to encounter in an abode so lowly. When I opened it to the title page, my wonder grew even greater, for it proved to be nothing less rare than Pigafetta's account of the Congo region, written in Latin from the notes of the sailor Lopez, and printed at Frankfort in 1598. I had often heard of this work, with its curious illustrations by the brothers de Bry, hence for a moment I forgot my uneasiness in my desire to turn the pages before me. The engravings were indeed interesting, drawn wholly from imagination and careless descriptions, and representing Negroes with the white skin and Caucasian features. Nor would I soon have closed the book, had not an exceedingly trivial circumstance upset my tired nerves and revived my sensation of disquiet. What annoyed me was merely the persistent way in which the volume tended to fall open to itself at plate 12, which represented in gruesome detail a butcher's shop of the cannibal Anziques. I experienced some shame at my susceptibility to so slight a thing, but the drawing nevertheless disturbed me, especially in connection with some adjacent passages descriptive of the Anzique gastronomy. I had turned to a neighbouring shelf and was examining its meagre literary contents, an 18th-century Bible, a Pilgrim's Progress of like period, illustrated with grotesque woodcuts and printed by the almanac maker Isaiah Thomas, the rotting bulk of Cotton Mather's Malignia Christi Americana, and a few other books of evidently equal age, when my attention was aroused by the unmistakable sound of walking in the room overhead. At first astonished and startled, considering the lack of response to my recent knocking at the door, I immediately afterward concluded that the walker had just awakened from a sound sleep, and listened with less surprise as the footsteps sounded on the creaking stairs. The tread was heavy, yet seemed to contain a curious quality of cautiousness, a quality which I disliked the more, because the tread was heavy. When I had entered the room I had shut the door behind me, Now, after a moment of silence during which the walker may have been inspecting my bicycle in the hall, I heard a fumble at the latch, and saw the panelled portal swing open again. In the doorway stood a person of such singular appearance that I should have exclaimed aloud but for the restraints of good breeding. Old, white-bearded and ragged, my host possessed a countenance and physique which inspired equal wonder and respect. His height could not have been less than 6 feet, and despite a general air of age and poverty, he was stout and powerful in proportion. His face, almost hidden by a long beard which grew high on the cheeks, seemed abnormally ruddy and less wrinkled than one might expect, while over a high forehead fell a shock of white hair, little thinned by the years. His blue eyes, though a trifle bloodshot, seemed inexplicably keen and burning. But for his horrible unkemptness, the man would have been as distinguished-looking as he was impressive. This unkemptness, however, made him offensive, despite his face and figure. Of what his clothing consisted I could hardly tell, for it seemed to me no more than a mass of tatters surmounting a pair of high, heavy boots, and his lack of cleanliness surpassed description. The appearance of this man, and the instinctive fear he inspired, prepared me for something like enmity, so that I almost shuddered through surprise and a sense of uncanny incongruity when he motioned me to a chair and addressed me in a thin, weak voice full of fawning respect and ingratiating hospitality. His speech was very curious, an extreme form of Yankee dialect I had thought long extinct, and I studied it closely as he sat down opposite me for conversation.
"Catched in the rain, be ye?"
he greeted.
"Glad you was nigh the house and had the sense to come right in. I calculate I was asleep, else I heard you. I ain't as young as I used to be, and I need a powerful sight of naps nowadays. Travelling fur? I hadn't seen many folks along this road since they took off the Arkham stage."
I replied that I was going to Arkham, and I apologized for my rude entry into his domicile, whereupon he continued,
"Glad to see you, young sir. New faces is scarce around here, and I ain't had much to cheer me up these days. Guess ye hail from Boston, don't ye? I never been there, but I can tell a town man when I see him. We had one for district schoolmaster in '84, but he sudden quit and no one never heard on him since."
Here the old man lapsed into a kind of chuckle, and made no explanation when I questioned him. He seemed to be in an unboundingly good humour, yet possessed those eccentricities which one might guess from his grooming. For some time he rambled on with an almost feverish geniality, when it struck me to ask him how he came by so rare a book as Pigafett's Regnum Congo. The effect of this volume had not left me, and I felt a certain hesitancy in speaking of it, but curiosity overmastered all the vague fears which had steadily accumulated since my first glimpse of the house. To my relief, the question did not seem an awkward one, for the old man answered freely and volubly.
"Oh, the Afriky book. Captain Ebenezer Holt traded me that in '68, and was killed in the war."
Something about the name Ebenezer Holt caused me to look up sharply. I had encountered it in my genealogical work, but not in any record since the Revolution. I wondered if my host could help me in the task at which I was labouring, and resolved to ask him about it later on. He continued,
"Ebenezer was on Salem merchantman for years, and I picked up sight of queer stuff in every port. He got this in London, I guess. He used to like to buy things at the shops. I was up to his house once, on the hill, trading horses when I see this book. I relished the pictures, and I gave it on him on a swap. 'Tis a queer book. Here, leave me get on me spectacles."
The old man fumbled among his rags, producing a pair of dirty and amazingly antique glasses, with small octagonal lenses and steel bows. Donning these, he reached for the volume on the table and turned the pages lovingly.
"Ebenezer could read a little of this. 'Tis Latin, but I can't. I had 2 or 3 schoolmasters read me a bit, and Parson Clark. Him say they got drowned in the pond. Can you make anything out of that?"
I told him that I could, and I translated for his benefit a paragraph near the beginning. If I erred, he was not scholar enough to correct me, for he seemed childishly pleased at my English version. His proximity was becoming rather obnoxious, yet I saw no way to escape without offending him. I was amused at the childish fondness of this ignorant old man for the pictures in a book he could not read, and wondered how much better he could read the few books in English which adorned the room. This revelation of simplicity removed much of the ill-defined apprehension I had felt, and I smiled as my host rambled on.
Queer how pictures can set a body thinking. Take this in here near the front. Have you ever seen trees like that, with big leaves a-flopping all and down, and them can't be niggers. They do beatin' all. Kinda like Indians, I guess, even if they do be Africy. Some of these here critters look like they might be monkeys or half men, but I never heard of nothing like this'n.
Here he pointed to a fabulous creature of the artist, which one might describe as a sort of dragon with the head of an alligator.
But now I'll show you the best'n, over here nigh in the middle.
The old man's speech grew a trifle thicker, and his eyes assumed a brighter glow, but his fumbling hands, though seemingly clumsier than before, were entirely adequate to their mission. The book fell open almost of its own accord, and as if from frequent consultation at this place, to the repellent 12th plate showing a butcher's shop amongst the antique cannibals. My sense of restlessness returned, though I did not exhibit it. The especially bizarre thing was that the artist had made his Africans look like white men. The limbs and quarters hanging about the walls of the shop were ghastly, while the butcher with his axe was hideously incongruous, but my host seemed to relish the view as much as I disliked it.
What do you think of this? Ain't never seen the like hereabouts, eh? When I see this, I tell Deb Holt, there's something to stir you up and make your blood tickle. When I read in scripture about slaying, like the Midianites was slew, I kinda think things, but I ain't got a picture of it. Here a body can see all there is to it. I suppose 'tis sinful, but ain't we all born and living in sin? That fella being chopped up gives me a tickle every time I look at him. I have to keep looking at him. See where the butcher cut off his feet? There's his head on that there bench, with one arm side of it, and t'other arm's on ground outside a meat block.
As the man mumbled on in his shocking ecstasy, the expression on his hairy spectacled face became indescribable, but his voice sank rather than mounted. My own sensations can scarcely be recorded. All the terror I had dimly felt before rushed upon me actively and vividly, and I knew that I loathed the ancient and abhorrent creature so near to me with an infinite intensity. His madness, or at least his partial perversion, seemed beyond dispute. He was almost whispering now, with a huskiness more terrible than a scream, and I trembled as I listened.
As I say, 'tis queer how pictures set you thinking. Do you know, young sir, I'm right sot on this'n here. Arthur got the book off Ebb. I used to look at it a lot, especially when I'd heard Parson Clark ranting Sundays in his big wig. Once I tried something funny. Here, young sir, don't get scared. All I done was to look at a picture afore I killed a sheep for market. Killing sheep was kinda more fun after looking at it.
The tone of the old man now sank very low, sometimes becoming so faint that his words were hardly audible. I listened to the rain, and to the rattling of the bleared small-paned panels, and marked a rumbling of approaching thunder, quite unusual for the season. Once a terrific flash and peal took the frail house to its foundations, but the whisperer seemed not to notice it.
Killing sheep were kinda more fun, but you know, 'twasn't quite satisfying. Queer how a craving gets a hold on you. As you love the Almighty, young man. Don't tell nobody, but I swear to God that picture began to make me hungry for victuals I couldn't raise nor buy. Here, set still, what's ailing you? I didn't do nothin'. I only wondered how 'twould be if I did. They say meat makes blood and flesh and gives you new life. So I wondered if 'twouldn't make a man live longer and longer and longer. It was more the same.
But the whisper never continued. The interruption was not due to my fright, nor to the rapidly increasing storm, amidst whose fury I was presently to open my eyes on a smoky solitude of blackened ruins. It was due to a very simple, though somewhat unusual, happening. The open book lay flat between us, with the picture staring repulsively upward. As the old man whispered the words,
More the same,
a tiny splattering impact was heard, and something showed on the yellow paper of the upturned volume. I thought of the rain and of a leaky roof, but rain is not red. On the butcher's shop of the Anzique cannibals, a small red spattering glistened picturesquely, lending vividness to the horror of the engraving. The old man saw it and stopped whispering, even before my expression of horror made it necessary. Saw it and glanced quickly towards the door of the room he had left an hour before. I followed his glance, and beheld just above us on the loose plaster of the ancient ceiling a large irregular spot of wet crimson, which seemed to spread even as I viewed it. I did not shriek or move, but merely shut my eyes. A moment later came the titanic thunderbolt of thunderbolts, striking the accursed house of unutterable secrets, and bringing the oblivion which alone saved my mind.
If you sleep in the moonlight, you dream. That was what he had been doing. God, what a dream. Suddenly awake, he found himself still sobbing, tense and high-strung, the blood pounding in his ears. Nightmare! This infernal moonlight! The rest of the room was in shadow, but across his face and pillow lay a beam of white radiance from the window, a wandering searchlight shaft out of the surrounding night and stillness. Warm and pringling, he brought his hands into the beams and covered his face with them. God, what a dream! He lay clutching his face. Remote across the mellow autumn night a dog bayed. The moonlight. A little wavelet of perfume drifted out of the darkness and lapped him. That bowl of Michaelmas daisies on the mantelshelf. He found the pressure of his fingers begin to relax involuntarily, his breath to come more easily. With a little laugh, he unblinded his eyes, so for a moment blinding them again in the moon radiance. He leant out of bed and groped in the blackness for the glass of ice water on his bedside table. Abruptly, its cold, smooth shape fitted into his fingers. He withdrew them with a gasp, lay petrified for a moment. Then, again in the grip of nightmare remembrance, scrambled erect in a wild disorder of sheets. The sounds sifted to stillness across the room. That ice-cold touch. You fool, she's laying beside you. But he found he could not look. His left arm crept out across the pillows, and then withdrew against his will. Of course she's there, lying full stretched in that way she has, hand under her cheek, hair a dark blot in the moonlight, one shoulder bare. Fast asleep, you fool. Then listen for her breathing. He listened. The night and its silences came into the room, listening also, crowding round the bed. The sweat started out on his forehead. Silence. He broke it with a sudden groan which echoed throughout the room, and then abruptly was caught and extinguished by the waiting quietness. He flung aside the sheets, closed his eyes, and pantingly, a shadow wrestling outside the moonlight beam, groped and pounded on the place where she should have lain. The dull thwacks of his blows sounded to his own ears oddly muffled. Suddenly, the watching shaft of moonlight vanished. At that he desisted and swung round in the disheveled bed, empty but for himself. Then he saw. The curtain was bellying and drifting across the window in a little waft of wind. Slowly it refurled and recoiled as he leant on his knuckles and watched it. The moonlight slipped into the room again. Below, in the darkness of the dining room, the clock struck 4. His frenzy had dropped from him. Dully, carefully, he got out of bed. The polished wood of the floor rose cold and radiant and faintly grainy to meet his feet. He stumbled to the window and put his head out into the moonlight and night air. Far across the sleeping town, the dog bayed again. Now dream. He remembered it all now. Coolly, detachedly, he found himself remembering each detail. The house was utterly quiet. He looked round the room, looked down at his hands stealthily, then jerked them up, peered at them closely, smelt them. And a sudden test occurred to him. He lifted them up before his eyes, against the moonlight, to see if they trembled. But in the wavering sheen he could not be sure. Not even of the hand which had. It was with his left hand he had struck her, just below the chin, with the curved point of the old jackknife kept in the boot cupboard. He remembered now the undreamlike impact of the blow and her panting fall, and how surprised he had been that the blood had not gushed out as he had always imagined it would. Often enough, in the mounting shame of the past few months, he had imagined that happening, but it had merely oozed a little red-rimmed patch, and his care in catching her as she fell and turning her over so that the kitchen linoleum might bear no stain of evidence had been needless. He had knelt and peered closely into her face, then noting the startled amaze of her eyes and the twitching of her mouth. After that, she had lain very still, and he had risen and gone to the sink and had drank some water. Standing now in the moonlight, he drank again, his hand steady, but as he lifted the glass he felt his arms ache. That was because of her weight in carrying her to the outhouse and laying her in the old tool chest. She had been surprisingly heavy, not that light weight his arms had known at other times, that first time of all in the hayfield by the sea. She had laughed up at him then, with the sunlight on her face, and covered her lips as he bent to kiss them. And they'd struggled a little, absurdly, in the sunlight and sea sound, and a gull had come circling in from the hidden shore and swooped and cawed beside them. She laughed at that, dropping her hand from her mouth, following the bird with her eyes while he kissed her unshielded lips. She'd left her lips unshielded to many since then. Why was the house so quiet? The curtain eddied towards him on another ghostly puff of wind. He put out his hand to steady it, and at that the moonlight ran nimbly up his arm. He stared at it, listening to the thumping of his own heart. If you sleep in the moonlight, you dream. Once she told him that idly, sleepily in his arms, when they looked out together at the full moon. He'd never imagined then there were other arms she could occupy with just such content. He'd gone all unknowing the facts for years, till men glanced at him and grinned, and women's looks were pitying, and hints of his humiliation multiplied and grew in volume. Lying beside her at nights, they had deafened him like the roar of that sea beside which he had first kissed her. Light of weight then, with her face a meeting pace of sun and laughter. Not like that white blotch in the darkness of the tool chest, a floating thing glimpsed a moment in the blackness, as he'd closed the lid and tiptoed back to the kitchen. 2 hours ago, the clock had struck 2 as he'd come up the stairs alone. He started. A warm bead of perspiration had rolled from his scalp to his shoulder, yet his body was shivering with cold. He got into bed again. The clock below struck the half-hour, and at that, as if awaiting the signal, the moonlight veered suddenly from his pillow and did not return. He lay in the darkness, cold, yet feeling his throat beginning to perspire unaccountably. Tomorrow he would bury the body. Tomorrow. But what was happening to it out there, alone and cold in the blackness? Did it move? Somewhere he read that though the heart may cease to beat, the brain may not immediately die. Supposing that behind that cold, battered face there were still thoughts, cold, slow thoughts, with no power to impress their urgings on the surrounding body, with dead nerves which could no longer carry the messages to action. But what if they could? If, impelled by some overwhelming purpose, the dead body could set itself in motion, burst open the chest, come out. In the dimness he grinned to himself strainedly. That was how others had given themselves away. They had imagined just such impossible things in just such still and waiting hours, had imagined them until they had become real. They had thought of the blind, dead bodies slowly creeping from the tool chest, crossing the garden, unlatching the kitchen window, creeping through, opening with dead, cold purpose the kitchen door, which gave upon the passage. What was that? A creak, a far ghost draught of air. He had left the kitchen door unlatched, of course. It could not be the body, face blood-oozing, sightless, coming along the passageway. Shuffle, shuffle, dead steps in the dark. Down at the foot of the stairs now, slowly, gropingly, turning to mount. He sprang out of bed with a thud, stamped his feet, and thereat the sound ceased. Or did they? The thing had turned. It had crossed to the sitting room. Crash! The door below slammed and shook. Desperation came upon him. He seized the electric torch from his bedside table, pulled open the bedroom door, and thudded downstairs. Towards where, in the blackness, he sensed was the foot of the stairs, he ceased to run and stood listening with a pounding heart. Thereon, with a winking, vanishing spear beam of moonlight, the sitting-room door slammed again. As it did so, something clammy chilled his face, and the clinkle of an overturned utensil came from the kitchen. He gave a croaking sob, reached the foot of the stairs in lurching bounds, and crossed the hall. Whimpering, he caught the handle of the sitting-room door. Always loose on its catch, flung it open and flashed his electric torch within. Lying on the table, the first object focused in the shaft of light, lay a sheet of paper. He heard a sighing moan, which he realized came from himself. He stood staring at the scrap of paper, remembering it. Shaking, he bent to reread it. It was the note from his wife, which he had found awaiting him on his return home the previous evening. She had gone to the theater and would probably stay with a friend and not return home till morning. He had dreamt it all. Oh, God, a dream after all. If you sleep in the moonlight, you dream. An immense relief came on him, and with it a blinding, searing vision. This last nightmare hour of his, it might have been born of reality with no awakening, no letter of salvation to end it, had his angry seethings and plottings of the last evening found vent. For he had guessed the identity of the friend with whom she had gone to stay. Murder in his heart. He had ranged through the rooms, peering from the windows down the street, till exhaustion came upon him. He must have dragged himself upstairs. A gurgling moan came from behind him. Torch in hand, he swung round confidently. Again in his face for a moment blew something cold. The damn kitchen door! With feet growing cold, he padded along the passage in the dead silence, through the kitchen, and there found that outer door had been verily left ajar. Hand on latch, he stopped and peered out into the moonlight. He did not remember having left the door open. How could he have done so? That was part of his dream. He smiled strainedly at the thought. Through the dim sheen bulked the outhouse. He made to close the kitchen door and then stopped. A nameless force swept him from the doorway, carried him down the garden path. He tore open the outhouse door, stumbled within, and flashed his torch upon the tool chest. And presently, through the still night and startling quiet folk from their beds, there rose scream upon scream of insane horror. If you sleep in the moonlight, you dream.
An Unreal Reality. A Tale of the Desert by Laura M. Dake. Is your name Edmund? Well, yes, I suppose I may lay claim to that name, since it was given me at my christening. Edmund Sparkler, the boys used to call me, because they said I had no bigot nonsense about me. But why do you ask? The speaker looked at me curiously, leaning forward for the purpose, since our campfire, flickering in the night wind, threw but a fitful and uncertain light around us. We lay in the midst of the great Sahara. Unless you have traversed the unpeopled solitudes of that vast plain, you can scarcely understand the gruesome feeling that masters one, in spite of himself, when he finds only a dead world about him. All day the garish sun had beaten pitilessly down upon our caravan. In vain I had swept the horizon for signs of some living thing, although the very air seemed peopled with invisible creatures, and throbbing with sounds beyond the range of the human ear. Sometimes I seemed to hear portions of conversations, always in whisper, and occasionally a laugh, if such weird cachinnations could be called such. How gladly I had welcomed the hour that had brought me into camp, and into closer companionship with my 3 countrymen. But the uncanny influence was still abroad, despite the genial sherry, the soothing cigar, and the enlivening conversation with which we tried to recompense ourselves for the discomforts of the day. The talk had flagged for a moment, and in the lull, a voice far off, yet clear as through a telephone, had sighed, "Edmund, beloved one, I am waiting." Then I had put my question to my fellow traveler, and in reply to his "Why do you ask?" had given the message. The effect was startling, for he sprang to his feet like one bereft of reason, crying out wildly, "God, it is she! Philo, my love, my own! Let me but hear your gentle voice, and I will follow wherever it may lead. Philo! Philo!" A moment later, to our surprise, he was gone. He had rushed away in the darkness, regardless of his course. Securing torches and lanterns, we began our search for him, but it was not until some hours later that we found him and induced him to return. And then, having no inclination to sleep, we sat beside the glowing coals, the darkness enclosing us like a wall, while we listened to his story. 8 times, my friends, have I crossed this great desert, but it is of what befell me on my first trip that I will speak. At that time, though but a mere youth, I was a trusted representative of a large Liverpool firm, and had been sent to Timbuktu on a special commission. I joined a caravan en route for that point, and managed to make myself as comfortable as possible amidst the inconveniences with which you are now acquainted. On the 4th day out, as I lay dozing, lulled by the swinging motion of my camel, the quiet was suddenly broken by a hubbub of exclamations. On looking up to discover the cause, I saw in the distance the white walls and spires of a city, amid a green foliage of palms and other tropical trees, while before it spread the blue waters of a lake that sparkled in the sunshine. Never had I beheld anything so enticing. "By St. George!" I cried. "Here is a chance for a tub!" You know what a bath means to an Englishman. And quickening my camel's speed, I turned him toward the beautiful city. But my Arab servant ran after me, panting with excitement, and, catching the leather thongs in my animal's nose, brought it to so sudden a halt that I nearly lost my balance. He paid no attention whatever to the 7 phials of wrath that I hurled at him in consequence, so eager was he to convince me that what I saw was only a mirage, and that unless I returned to the caravan my bones would be left to bleach on the lonely plain. I only laughed at him as being either a knave or a fool, as did my 2 countrymen, who now joined me and fully agreed with me that the old story of a mirage was simply a device of the rascally Arabs in the caravan to avoid the delay of a halt. Of course, we were perfectly familiar with the theory of the mirage, and talking glibly in regard to the reflection and refraction of light through different strata of atmosphere. But the case in hand, we said, did not come under that head. We could not possibly discredit what our senses confirmed, and there before us lay the city, the waving palms, and the blue lake over which many white-winged craft were gliding. Our servants, who could not resist the promised purse of glittering coins, continued, though reluctantly, to accompany us. So, undeterred by their doleful predictions, we went gaily on toward the entrancing spot that seemed to hold such pleasant promises. But an unforeseen calamity came upon us. All at once our camels lifted their long necks and sniffed the air. Then, uttering a peculiar cry, they dropped to their knees, stretching themselves close to the earth, and buried their noses in the sand. At that same moment our servants cried in terrified tones, "The Simoom!" and threw themselves beside the prostrate beasts, we, without question, imitating their example. Scarcely had we gained this insecure shelter when the storm came sweeping down upon us, hot as a blast from the lower regions, bringing with it clouds of sand and seemingly filled with muttered curses hurled defiantly at us. The transition from the pleasing prospect of a promised paradise to the terrible reality of a veritable Hades was so sudden as somewhat to daze my senses, and I can only indistinctly recall my sensations as I lay there prostrate beside my trembling beast, waiting for death. And for such a death. I thought of the piles of bleaching bones that had marked our route, and then of my own, which would inevitably become the factors of another heap. The idea was unendurable, and must have half-maddened me, for in the agony of it I sprang to my feet. As I did so, a pair of devilish hands seemed to clutch and whirl me around with such demoniac fury as to deprive me of all sensation. When I came to myself again, I could scarcely credit my good fortune. I was seated under a waving palm tree from which hung ripe dates in great abundance. The waters of a lovely lake gently lapped the shore nearby, and a breeze fanned me with refreshing coolness. After all, the city was a reality as I knew it was, I said to myself. My companions must have brought me here while I was unconscious. I wonder how far I was carried by the whirl, and if they escaped unhurt. But why am I here alone? Where can they be? I looked long and anxiously up the wide, clean street with its rows of snowy houses, and then along the white beach, but nowhere among the busy throng could I see them. Then I sat down again and waited. People passed and repassed, some saluting silently and all eyeing me with curiosity. They apparently belonged to all conditions of life, their garments of every conceivable style and texture, indicating the cosmopolitan character of the city. After waiting what seemed to be an interminable time, I began to fear lest some evil had befallen my friends, one of whom was inclined to be too convivial on occasion. So I pinned a note to the tree saying as a grim little joke, "Gone to dinner, will return in an hour." Then I started in quest of them. The streets were spotlessly clean. They were bordered by graceful trees, while every now and then was a park sparkling with fountains and brilliant with sweet-scented flowers. Horseless vehicles glided noiselessly by. People stood in groups laughing and talking, yet only subdued murmurs reached me. The absence of haste and the noise, coincident with a place teeming with life, struck me as very pleasant, though unusual. What a contrast to Liverpool with its bustle and confusion! It was like a dream, and yet a waking dream, if such could be. As the hours wore on and no signs of my companions could be found, I sat down upon a bench that stood beneath the overhanging branches of a tree, and began to consider my situation. Beyond all doubt, here I was in the mysterious city that my servant had declared did not exist, had called a mirage, a city so real and yet so unreal. Could I be dreaming? No, I was never more fully conscious in my life, and could I but relieve my mind of its anxiety in regard to my companions, would give myself a few hours' solid comfort and rest. As I sat there, uncertain as to my next move, a gentleman approached, and having saluted me graciously, seated himself beside me. He was a pleasant-faced person of middle age, neatly dressed, though in a fashion somewhat out of date. Encouraged by his friendly air, I said, "Sir, it is indeed surprising to find so lovely a city in the heart of this great desert. Will you tell me its name?" "It is called the Eternal City," he replied. "Not Rome?" I said in surprised interrogation. "Nay, friend, for ancient Rome, with all its vaunted power, fell, while nothing within the walls that begirt us can ever perish." "Nothing can ever perish?" I echoed, my voice falling into the whispered cadence of his. "How can that be possible? The sentence of death was passed upon all things at the beginning of time, and there is and can be no reprieve, no extension. Life, good sir, is an unmeaning tragedy, and eternity a calamity in which there is neither rhyme nor reason." I spoke with more warmth than was my wont, and was somewhat abashed to catch a gleam of pity in my companion's eye, as he smiled on me very kindly without replying. To cover my confusion, I said, "But that is neither here nor there. What most concerns me at present is to find the whereabouts of a couple of gentlemen with whom I am traveling. Perhaps you have seen them somewhere about your city. Two portly, beef-eating Englishmen, jolly and ruddy, wearing cork hats and checked trousers." "Nay, friend," was the answer. "Strangers such as thou describest are not frequent visitors here. Thou art the first in many years, so set your mind at rest in regard to your traveling companions, for wherever else they may be, they are not in the Eternal City." "It should have been called the City of Silence," I said, "for I never dreamed there could be a place so full of go, and yet so still." "There are sounds enough, friend," was the reply, "but thine ear is not attuned to them. Why, the atmosphere of the earth is throbbing with sounds that are never heard by its inhabitants, since they are both above and below the range of the normal human ear. But we who are adapted to life upon this plane find all things harmonize with our condition." "To life on this plane?" I exclaimed. "Is life here different from life elsewhere on our planet? Or am I dead, and are we both ghosts?" "Ghosts," he repeated with a smile. "How strange it seems to be called a ghost, yet I can recall a time when I too so classed souls who had laid aside earth conditions and had taken up life under new ones." Then, changing his reminiscent tone, he said assuringly, "Have no fear for thyself on that score, Edmund, for thou art no ghost, since thy body of dust still holds the vital spark called life. As for myself, well, am I not alive? And art thou not in the midst of a city peopled with sentient beings whom time is powerless to destroy? Men of earth call it a mirage, an illusion of the senses, but we who enjoy its beauty and bask in the security of its unchanging reality laugh at the impotent folly of their so-called science, which has never at hand a ready-made reason for the deepest mysteries of the Almighty." I listened idly as he spoke, remembering meantime that, notwithstanding the superior advantages of the Eternal City, there were business relations that demanded my immediate presence elsewhere, and somewhat irrelevantly inquired concerning methods of egress, adding, "There are certain caravans frequently leaving your city, I presume?" "Nay," he replied, "we live within ourselves, shut in securely by walls of magnetic force, crystal clear, yet strong as adamant." "Ah, I see," I said. "Your community is on the cooperative plan. Sorry, I can't stay longer and see how that theory works in actual practice, but business demands my presence in Timbuktu. About how far do you call it to that place?" "Timbuktu," he replied dreamily. "Ah, yes, I recall it. It lies on the southern verge of the desert, and overlooks a chain of marshes with their fringes of palms and mimosa. In past ages it was a flourishing city, but now it is a mean enough place. In fact, it has become so wretched under the depredations of marauding tribes that it bears the ominous name of Ur-Amandes. God hears not. As to the distance thither, I cannot say. It is not always the same from the Eternal City, since we are not stationary. Our position is constantly changing, owing to the different currents of air, the revolution of the earth, and other causes. In fact, we live in a floating city. We are here today and there tomorrow, always, however, within the earth's atmosphere, though invisible to its inhabitants, except under certain infrequent conditions." I had become weary of his vagaries and rose to take my leave. Well, I must be moving also, since I have already delayed too long. I am very glad to have met you, and should you ever come to Liverpool, I shall be delighted to return your courtesy. You see, so absolutely unimaginative was I that I refused to believe in the Mirage City, and looked upon my new acquaintance as a harmless lunatic. I handed him my card as I continued. "And now, if it is not asking too much, I shall be glad to have your company to the nearest transportation office, where I can arrange for continuing my journey." "There is no transportation office, my friend," he replied. "Thine only chance is to get outside the walls and join a passing caravan. But come, it is idle to waste words. Thou art one of those who must learn their lessons from experience." As he spoke, he moved forward, I following, and soon I found myself on the outskirts of the city. Far as the eye could reach lay endless wastes of shimmering sand, and, oh joy, there, outlined against the saffron horizon, was the silhouette of a caravan. "Thank heaven!" I cried. "Now I need delay no longer." "Not if thou canst cross the wall," said my companion calmly. "Wall? What wall?" I asked. "I see no barrier between me and the desert beyond. So good-bye, and thank you very much." My companion pressed in silence the hand I had extended, and followed me slowly as I went forward. I did not go far, however, for incredible as it may appear, in spite of my utmost efforts, I could not pass a certain limit. Thus far and no farther was the unwritten law, stronger than as if Draco had inscribed it in blood. Again and again, at different points, I tried to pass the mysterious barrier that stood between me and the way I desired, but every effort was futile. At last I became exasperated, and remembering my football tactics, I stepped well back and made a rush that I felt confident would win the goal. But to my surprise, I was hurled violently back. My companion assisted me to arise, saying gently, "Dost thou not see, friend, that thy utmost efforts are useless? Believe me when I say that it is absolutely impossible for thee to cross the wall encompassing this city, unless under the law certain conditions be given." "I see no wall," I persisted almost sullenly. "It is there, however, crystal clear, and invisible to thee. A wall of magnetic force stronger than adamant." "By the way," I said, "it seems reasonable that if I came in through your magnetic wall, I ought to be able to get out." "So one would judge," he replied, "and what puzzles me is how didst thou get in?" "Oh, that is no mystery," I returned. "I saw your city, and, in company with the 2 Englishmen and a couple of servants, started to reach it. Along came a simoom, hotter than Sheol. Something grabbed me up from the ground, whirled me around until my head felt like a mill race, and when my brain cleared, why, here I was." "The simoom," said my companion thoughtfully. "Ah, that accounts for it. It is filled with wicked influences, with disembodied entities who hold a pitiless grudge against the human race and never lose a chance to vent it. They have wonderful powers for working evil, and when in their diabolical glee they enter a simoom, they whirl and twirl the lines of magnetic force as playfully as a—" He paused for a simile, and I suggested, "as a cowboy swings his lariat on the Texas plains." "As anything thou pleasest," he rejoiced, smiling. "It is all one, since thou art here, and here thou must bide the time of thy return, with the world none the wiser. Thou certainly art placed in a peculiar position, being dead and yet alive, in the earth's sense." "You speak in riddles," I said, for even then I did not understand what he meant. "But please tell me in plain English how long I shall be detained." "The will be as the law determines," he replied. "The law?" I cried in tones of disgust. "What law? Are you ruled by a tyrant whose will is law? Have you no dynamite?" "He who holds the universe in the hollow of his hand laughs at anarchy, my boy," he said. "He is the law. But calm thyself, and trust me fully. My home shall be thy home during thy stay, and I trust that each hour may be one of perfect contentment." But I did not accept his hospitable offer until I had renewed my efforts to cross the barrier, which of course were futile. And utterly exhausted, I was forced to abandon them. Temporarily, at least, I said. Then, having no other choice, I went back with him to the city. His home was a dream of beauty. The house, whose walls were of a material resembling ivory, was classic in design, and stood in the midst of a spacious lawn, green and smooth as velvet, shaded by tropical trees and brilliant with odorous flowers. Through the open windows came strains of music, the most entrancing I had ever heard, and vibrant with the power and goodness of the Creator. I bared my head as I listened, and my soul seemed to shrink into a mere speck, as all the egotism, the littleness, and the folly of my narrow nature were revealed to my introspective gaze. I hung my head for very shame. Without a word, my companion plucked a lovely lotus blossom from the basin of a fountain, beside which we stood, and placed it in my hand. Instinctively divining his wishes, I buried my face in its golden heart, and inhaled its fragrance. When I looked up again, lo, it was not I, the sin-laden wretch who but a moment before had been ready to sink into the very earth for shame. All the vexations, the miseries, and the knowledge of them had slipped away. All discord had vanished, and a perfect peace that passeth understanding had come instead. The Liverpool firm, Timbuktu, and all the world that held them were now but the shadows of a shade. Never before had I known the meaning of life. What I hitherto had called life was but a mockery, a heavy load under which I prayed I might never again have to groan and sweat. When I gave utterance to these thoughts, my companion said sadly, "And yet, alas, thou art fated to bear the burden a little longer, since thy years are not yet ripe. But fret not thy heart about the future. Here come those whom thou must know, since they belong to my household." As he spoke, a band of youths and maidens came trooping down the broad white steps of the mansion, and across the lawn to where we stood, all greeting me graciously. "These are my sons and daughters," said my companion, his face beaming with affection as they clustered around him. "Yes, these are my children," he continued, adding, in answer to my look of inquiry at their number, "not as thou of earth countest one's children, for often there, the offspring of a common mother and father, are as antipodal as though belonging to different races. Such conditions do not exist here. These are my children by adoption, as it were. They are brothers and sisters in the true sense of the words, in thoughts and tastes, congenial in all that pertains to existence, with no sweet bells jangled out of tune to mar its perfect harmony. Some came to me when mere infants, and have grown to manhood and womanhood without knowing aught of the trials and temptations of earth. Ah, if the sorrowing mother bereft of her babe could only know! Here now is my sweet Philo. And he glanced lovingly at a tall, fair young girl, who stood near, watching the innocent sports of her companions. She came to us when only a year old, as thou countest time, and knows no other life than the one passed here. She shall be thy guide and thy companion while thou art with us. Which shall be forever, I cried with enthusiasm as the lovely girl came, obedient to his summons, and took my hand trustingly in her own. Which shall be as the law decrees, murmured he, as he moved away, leaving me with my sweet young guide. How joyously the hours flew by! I took no note of them, since there was no thought of time, nor were we harassed and hampered by physical wants, since they were easily supplied. We simply drew from the elements around us all that was requisite in the way of food and clothing. Consider the lilies, we sang, knowing in its perfect fullness all the beauty of that divine message. Edmund's voice had been growing soft and dreamy, and now he ceased speaking. For some moments the solemn silence of the night was broken only by the sighing of the wind and the regular breathing of our companions, who had long since fallen asleep. At length I said suggestingly, "And Philo?" "No more of Philo," replied Edmund as one awakened from a weary dream. "If you have never loved, you cannot understand me. And if you have given all that is best and noblest in your nature to a woman worthy of such a gift, then I need not tell you of the sweet hopes, each day fulfilled, that sanctify the remembrance of that sacred time, now gone, but not forever. Surely, if life is eternal, we shall meet again. I could almost curse this body of dust that holds me from her, and would willingly my quietus make, but dare not, for the terrible law, which none can evade, bars out the self-destroyer from such fair places. Instead of our becoming thus united, we would be thrown farther asunder." "Right and sensible you are, Edmund," I said, "and I respect your reticence, but I'm curious to know how you crossed those awful barriers and took up your career again on Earth." "I really cannot gratify you with the details," he replied. "The first thing that I remember in regard to the matter is hearing a voice say with rasping distinctness, 'An Englishman?' "Yes," was the reply. "He was brought here some weeks ago by 2 of his countrymen. It seemed that they had left the caravan, being deceived by a mirage, and had been overtaken by a simoom, barely escaping with their lives. This young man was found at some distance from the place where they had thrown themselves down. He was alive, though unconscious, so they brought him with them to this point, since he too was on his way hither. His condition is quite interesting, being a trance of unusual length. Step in and look at him." They stood a while beside me discussing in business-like tones trances and similar phenomena, and then I felt one of my lids lifted and saw a pair of gray eyes twinkling with curiosity. The owner gave an exclamation of surprise and lifted my other lid, and lo, there I was, looking back at him. I recovered, of course, and soon as I was able, explained matters to my firm, executed my commissions, and returned to England. But my peace of mind was gone. Things of this earth seem so narrow and pitiful. The struggle for gold that we can only jingle a day. The desire for fame that is but a passing breath. The selling of souls for power and place. Exchanging birthrights for messes of pottage. Here he broke off again, and after a few moments said, "You heard her call me tonight.